All right, and we are cooking. And oh, I see. I goofed. I'm in the directory for yesterday. So again, like ls and print working directory are my friends. So I know what directory my terminal's in that I'm working in right now. I'm going to use the touch command to create in this directory the files that I want that we're going to work with. An HTML file, a JavaScript file, a CSS file, and the notes file. And I'm just going to use this here, and I'm just going to open them up so they're all there and we're ready to roll. And you get going. And it's actually so Command P is a great command if you folks haven't used it for Visual Studio Code. Like once you start knowing like what files you need to, and if you open VS Code to the right directory so that everything in there you care about, it'll scope it a bit better. So that's a great way to switch. And that's like, as our projects get bigger, it does start to make, I think, a bigger difference just to start leveraging our editors a bit more and taking advantage of that. So we looked at some DOM event stuff. I think a good starting point is probably some button clicking. And we'll do that for a bit of a warm up, and then I'll talk a bit more formally about events. And I think that's the plan. So I'm just gonna there we go. Yeah, now that I'm starting to remember, I am really enjoying it. So I've got my document. Let's go ahead and put some stuff in it. I think the main thing is we want an HTML input element. We want a button. And we'll worry about what we're going to do with this button in a sec. And I want some JavaScript. And I'm going to use, and I think I'll put it down at the bottom of the body, just for simplicity's sake, script tag to import my JavaScript. And as always, I like to test out that stuff works. It's not quite test-driven development, but it's borrowing from that philosophy. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure now that I correctly connected my JavaScript file to my HTML file, which I did, which is great. Because I have this little hello message here, and that's from this index.js file. And as we kind of walked through the other day, as the browser parses and reads this HTML file, and when it gets here, it makes the request back to the web server, which in this case is live server, but I could also, use the Python command line tool and to run a Python web server, which is what we'll do with Django. And then the browser starts executing this JavaScript. And now we can start to do stuff a bit more interestingly. And this is a bit of just a warm up and a refresher to like, I think this is what folks were working on yesterday. or variations on this theme, and we'll build a couple of these and we'll talk a bit more about the DOM. So right now, speaking of abstraction, we know that the button attribute has this element on click, and we kind of understand what's happening with the DOM and things, but it's a little bit magic right now, and that's okay. The main thing that we know is that for this on click attribute, I can give it a JavaScript function here. Either a JavaScript function that lives in a different JavaScript file that the browser loads, or I write some JavaScript inline. And what did I do wrong?
Close that arrow on the input tab.
Oh yeah, thank you. Placeholder. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and that is one of the problems with HTML, to be honest. Writing HTML is that we don't get like error messages, we get silent failures. Something that I do with great success when I can't for the life of me figure out the cause of the problem, I start commenting stuff out, and it's command / is the VS Code command to comment out a line of code. And I will simply comment out every line of code in my program until I get something working, and then just start adding lines back in one at a time, because sometimes that helps me focus. Like I only have to look for typos in one line at a time, for example. And now this is working, which is awesome. But of course, instead of writing the JavaScript inline, which would get really messy quite quickly for a bigger program, we want to call the JavaScript program that our browser is loading from this other JavaScript file. And I know that there's a real context switching cost between moving between Python and JavaScript. In the real world, programmers definitely try to minimize context switching. There are just so many benefits for the purposes of this program to learning both JavaScript and Python front end and back end that the trade-off is worth it. And so again, I'm not quite doing test-driven development with red-green refactor, but I'm making sure that I'm using a console log statement after every change to confirm that my code is behaving correctly. And now we're starting to get, I think, to some of the more interesting parts from what we had yesterday, where I've got an input ID and I want to grab its value. And let's go ahead and do that. So we're not going to console log. We're going to do the trusty get element by ID input name argument. And in fact, I think I'm just going to do .inner HTML, which will get the actual text. And in fact, I'm just going to console log that right now and make sure that that works. So nothing's there, which is kind of what we expect. And I did indeed do something wrong because I'm hitting submit and I'm not seeing the name that I type in there print out. So again, a great debugging technique is simplifying. Let's have this one line of code do less work and see what happens. So that's great. So I'm getting the element on the DOM. I just goofed in getting the value from it. And someone probably knows what I did wrong here. Can anyone offer some advice maybe? So now we're working, and I always get confused, to be honest. There's the inner.html property and the .value property. So I think the main thing really to know is that they're both there, and it's because this input element, you can type stuff in it. It's not inner HTML like it would be with a paragraph tag, like we'll see in a sec. And this is great because now I'm just kind of building up the feature that I want piece by piece. And I'm going through the guide from yesterday, and this is a bit of a refresher on the DOM. And then in a minute too, we'll talk a bit more formally about events and event bubbling, and look at a form. So this is a great start, but what we really want is to be able to change something in the browser window. And let's, in fact, I'm going to flip it up a bit, and let's do a paragraph tag and say my name is, and then in here we'll put a span tag, and we'll give the span an ID. And we'll just put like name value, which is not the most cleverest ID for the span, but that's okay. And again, I'm not really doing test-driven development, but even after writing that one line of HTML, I just keep double checking that my code is doing what I expect it to, because if something goes wrong, I only have 2 lines I have to look at for a typo. And so then maybe actually, can someone walk me through, like, I want to change the value of the inner HTML of this span element so it will display the name or whatever I type in here when I hit this button. And can someone maybe give me a little guidance on how to do that?
You're going to have to find it by ID. So it's going to be the get element by ID. You're going to declare, a variable that is just output, I guess. And then the element ID is whatever you just called it. Yeah. And then you're going to set display name equal to the name input.
Yeah, name.
Or actually name value, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I added a couple layers here too. Awesome. Yeah, let's give this a shot. Okay, so it's not quite working. I'm getting this type error, assignment to constant variable on line 9. So that's my bad, because this is this is a const, so I can change this to a let. Let's see what happens now. So that's not quite right either, but you're almost there. There's just one piece I think that is missing here.
I think you need to add back in the inner HTML thing you had earlier.
Yeah, totally. And just to recap on why that is and what the inner HTML is. And I figured too, I kind of figured if you were writing this code, you would have gotten that. I know it's harder to talk someone through it over Zoom too. Let's use the inspector. So that inner HTML term, again, we've got this HTML element, a span element, and then inside the element is that value, right? We have a node in the tree. The type of the node is it's a span element, and the value of that node, well, there's a lot of properties of that node, and that's why they call it inner HTML, because we can't quite say value, because it honestly gets confusing. And I probably should just rename this to the output, to be honest, because I think this is confusing. And a bit hard to read. So let's do that. And let's do that. I can probably change this back to a const because I'm not actually going to change the display name variable. I'm changing this property on it. And let's see how this goes. And we're cooking. And now we are interacting with the DOM in the browser. Yeah, and I know that people, we looked at this yesterday, and I know that people were doing more with this. How are people feeling about this? Is this like a good review?
Can you go back to the HTML document in the JS code? So where you've got inner HTML, nope, the HTML one, please.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So line 12, inner HTML value, that's a variable.
Great question. And actually, let me, oh, it didn't. So inner HTML, that is a really good question. And just to go a little nuts, like, I don't know if this makes it easier or harder to read. I don't think it should change. Yeah, it doesn't change how it's laid out at all. So Icarus, you're totally correct. Within the document object model, this display name is a variable. With our HTML file, this is all just text, right? So right now, this is just text. When the browser reads and parses this HTML file, it builds a tree, and each node in the tree is an element. And it's kind of easier to see, and that's why I wanted to break this up. And so it creates a node that's a paragraph tag, and a child of that node is, yeah, I think probably another node. So yeah, I guess it is a variable, but, and let me check into, because I think I might have misunderstood your question.
No, so the reason why I think it's a variable is because you changed it by, what's it, inner HTML dot value.
Yeah,
So it's, to my brain, that thinks kind of like a dictionary or something, right? So like you're taking the first part of it and looking at the key is inner HTML value. The variable is whatever the text is in that spot, and you've replaced that text with name value.
correct. And I think the reason I got a little hung up was like, if this was an HTML, if this was not an HTML file, if it was a .csv file, we wouldn't say that this was a variable, right? Everything in here is data in the file itself. But you're totally correct that then that data gets read into the browser and it creates a whole bunch of variables of objects. It's creating objects for each little bit in the whole document. We take all this data and turn it into a whole bunch of objects and bundle it up in another object that we just call a document. Does that?
Yes, it does. What would it look like if you wanted to change the my name is part instead of the inner HTML part?
Yeah, great question.
So how would you code it to change the stuff on line 15 instead of the stuff on line, what's it, 17?
Yeah, let's see. I think I know how to do that. Let's see if I can. That's a great call. And let's do it like this. Let's also change the value of the text in our P tag. So there's two things. First, we have to select the DOM node in our DOM tree document we want to change. Then we have to change the value of the text it renders. And again, think about like when we wrote that bank accounts program, you know, your program is doing work and then you have to tell it to print to the screen, right? The browser is doing work and then at some point it renders to the screen. But with the browser, it renders not just plain text, much more visual and interesting stuff. So there's a couple ways we could grab this paragraph tag, right? I could do, and this is a great example. Thank you for suggesting this, Icarus. document. And to kind of refresh on the document, when our JavaScript is running in the browser creates a class instance, this object called document, and that lets us interact with like the browser's version of our HTML page, right? It's taken all that raw data of the HTML file and it's created a bunch of objects, and this document class is how we interact with it. And this is actually a great way to prototype. Like we could do document.get elements by class name. And I think I just pass in the string of the class. And if I console log that, let's see what, actually, let's do this. This might be a little too messy. Let's try. Get elements by class name P. And it's returning an array, or, get elements by class. I need to, this is a great example of what it's like to be a programmer. I haven't used that method in a minute. And so I'm going to Google, and I was doing it wrong because I was trying to get it by class name, but I actually I was in my brain, I was thinking of like kind of element. So I got totally confused.
I think Zach's method in chat would work. If you just took the P tag and assigned it an ID, then
Yep.
you could just touch it by that ID, right?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's the other way to do it as well. Element by tag. Yeah, I kind of wanted to do it the one way and then the other. The ID is the way that we would want to do it. Just to close the loop on this, I'm going to get the get element by tag name working. And then we'll do exactly that.
So can you show us an example where you do something like, hello, my name is Jim, and today is Wednesday? As an example, so you're entering, when you click a button, so you add a variable, and you click a button and it produces some text and reads input, or is that too far ahead of where we're at?
Let me finish implementing Icarus's example, and then let's come back to that one. That would actually be a good one too, I think. And I'm going to run with Zach's advice about like giving the paragraph tag an ID, but just to demonstrate, we were able to get all the paragraph tags in our document. And actually, let me very quickly, I'll demonstrate that too, like the second paragraph, because I think this is good to see. So this one is our first paragraph, and it's got a bunch of stuff. If we look at the inner HTML, because it has this other HTML element inside it. The second paragraph just has this bit of text inside it. So we have this method that looks through the document, this object in memory that represents our HTML page in the browser, finds all the paragraph tags and returns it in an array for us. And then, as was pointed out, like a much cleaner way of doing this is, I'm just going to do paragraph 1, just for an ID that's really easy to read. And then I think, Icarus, we wanted to change the value of the text. So this is going to actually mess up a bit of stuff, but it'll be cool to see. And what did we want to change it to?
Just anything. I just want to see how we would change that. But I understand the concept of it now, thanks to the dudes in chat.
Yeah, Zach and guys, yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good one. And so watch what happens when I do this though. We changed all the stuff inside that first paragraph. So there's probably a little bit more work we'd have to do because the first paragraph has two things in the inner HTML, this text, and then this span element, and we really only want to change the first one. And that's a bit more of a complex task.
Gotcha, that makes sense.
Yeah. If we want to change paragraph 2, on the other hand, because there's only the one thing inside of it, that's much easier, though it looks like oh no, that's working correctly. Okay, I just got confused. And Jim, what was what were you interested in us implementing again?
I think it's a lot akin to what you just did. I was just, that whole idea of changing the content of that paragraph by giving an ID is what I think I was interested in.
Got it. Yeah. And actually we can add a DOM elements. And actually this is, I think, cool to see. Let's see, document create elements. So let's put something like inside the paragraph tag. And I'm going to have to borrow. I am just going to copy this code, I think.
Can you give us some context about why you would create an element?
Yeah, like there's a lot of interactivity you can make happen that way. Like, for example, I don't know exactly how Google Docs does it. It may not do it this way. This menu, it didn't exist. We have to add it to the document, the DOM, because that's what the browser renders everything from. So we have all of a sudden added like a new node in the tree. This is another node in our DOM tree now too. And actually, let's look at this in the inspector. And this is where frameworks like React come in. Like we don't like code stuff like that by hand. But now if I click on this, yeah, I'm not sure, it may not actually be adding DOM elements. There are a couple other techniques for doing this, but that is one example use case. And actually, I think I'll pause on adding the element because I do want to talk about like events and event bubbling. And it's 9:30. Yeah, so I think what I want to do is, and we do actually have a good example code of that in the curriculum. So yeah, I could. Yeah, I'll steal it and show it very quickly. So this is a great example of how to borrow or steal code. I am 100% copying and pasting this code from our curriculum doc. Except that was the wrong code. There we go. So there's a lot of things going on here. I created a function, insert new elements. We're using the document class, the document object that the browser will give our JavaScript code, and this method create element. It's going to create a div. Let's create a paragraph tag instead. We have to add the text. We can even set the class name. This class isn't being used for anything, but
Can you set an ID for that too?
we should be able to. That's a great question. Yeah, and this is like, I'm also modifying this stuff because it helps me understand the code that I just copied. And like, this is the part that we have to change that's kind of critical because there is no element with the ID, parent ID in my code. So let's use paragraph 2. And let's see what happens when we do this and how this works. And let me make sure I got that right. Yep. We've got this if statement here, which is honestly a little bit of overkill. Because when I write this code, I'm just going to assume that it works. I'm also going to put this comment up here because that helps me not lose my mind. And let's see if that works. Yeah. So that should do it. And then the last step is, let's just call this function. And let's put a console log statement here. And actually, this is a great debugging technique, as simple as it sounds. Like, if I write a bunch of code, I kind of anticipate that I've made a mistake somewhere. This console log statement tells me that the JavaScript program got this far running in the browser, right? And we're about to call this function. This one tells me that the function was called. And then what I'll do when I like really need to debug is like, I might put this here and I might say like element created. And then I might over here put element added. And then if something goes wrong, I can look at the console logs and see how far we got. And that tells me which lines of code the problem is in. But fingers crossed, we won't have any problems. And in fact, it happens right away because the browser executes everything in that JavaScript file when we get there. And we have this newly created paragraph. And if we look at it in the inspector, we can't tell visually because there's nothing representing that, but we indeed added a child node to the DOM tree. This paragraph now has another child node in the tree that's another paragraph.
But none of that is actually saved to the base HTML file. That's just
Exactly.
after the fact.
Yeah, exactly. Like the HTML file is data. It's the CSV file. What's a little special about an HTML file is it does do a bit more than just text data, because it also tells the browser, go grab this other data. But this data happens to be JavaScript code, and then the browser starts executing it. And like the HTML file is never changed. And actually, this I think would be cool to see. Like, check this out. If I look in the Elements tab, this is the paragraph that our JavaScript code added. This is a newly created paragraph. If I go to the Sources tab to look at the index.html file that our browser requested from the server, that doesn't exist. It's just the 2 paragraphs. There is no third paragraph. Because exactly like you were saying, Icarus, like that never existed in that text file, in that data. It's like, again, our Python program imports the CSV file, and then we mess with the data that we got from that file. And that's what we're doing with the document object model. We're messing with the document in memory in our browser. Does that make a little bit of sense to folks? And it's awesome. Like this, and this is also why this stuff is complex. I think there was one thing. Yeah, I'm not going to worry about, like, you folks can figure out how to add a button to add the paragraph. I think I'll leave that as like an exercise to the user, though. Actually, we can implement that relatively quickly. So it would look like this. Let's put it just down here. And the name of our method is insert new element. And we don't get nice auto completion, unfortunately. Add new paragraph. Node element. And here, we're not going to call that code. And voila. And that's actually a lot of fun. I'm enjoying clicking on that button. And then what React does is it does a lot of this work for us. Should we take a short break and then we can talk about like DOM events and event bubbling and listeners more? Because that's a pretty core concept with DOM stuff. And that's really the main focus for today. But this I figured would be a useful review and warm up, and also to show a little bit of like the flow of how to write code and debug now that we're starting to write JavaScript that's interacting with HTML running in the browser. How does like a short break sound? Like it's 9:42, like let's take like a 5-minute break, really like a 7-minute break, and at 9:50 we'll look at DOM events. Awesome. Okay, see everyone in like 5 or 6. And this one I will make sure that I won't be late for. So thank you folks, and see everyone soon.